In this video, we discuss lesson 5.1, which is all about discrete probability distributions. These slides are based on slides provided by Pearson to accompany our textbook. They're also based on slides provided by my friend and colleague, James Lively at Tulsa Community College. He's an excellent statistics professor, and he was kind enough to share his slides with me the first time I taught statistics. After looking at James' slides and Pearson's slides, I modified them for our course. I added graphics, I changed a bit of the wording. I added extra examples and pictures, added phrases and paragraphs for clarification so that these slides would better support you as you do your homework and better support you as you prepare for exams. So this is our first lesson in Chapter 5. Chapter 5 has a number of sections, but we're only going to cover 2 in our course due to time constraints. The first section is called probability distributions, but I will emphasize that it's really about discrete probability distributions. All of Chapter 5 is about discrete probability distributions. So we're going to learn about those. We're going to introduce those in section 5.1. And then after we introduce those, in lesson 5.2 and section 5.2, we're going to talk about a special case, binomial probability distributions. This is all from Chapter 5 in Essentials of Statistics, 6th edition by Mario Triola. So here's an overview of Chapter 5. Basically, the idea is we're going to combine ideas from Chapters 2 and 3 with ideas from Chapter 4. So remember back in Chapters 2 and 3, we learned to summarize and organize data in frequency distributions and then visualize them in histograms. And then we learned to measure the center of that data set. We learned to find measures of variation. And in addition, we learned to find measures of relative standing, look at how certain data values compare to other data values in the set. So chapters 2 and 3 are part of what's called descriptive statistics because they're using real sample data and then we're finding actual results. We're trying to summarize and describe what we found. So for example, you might have 100 trials in which each trial consists of 2 coin tosses. So in one trial, you toss a coin twice and you count the number of heads. And then in another trial, you toss the coin twice and count the number of heads. And you do this 100 times. And then you create a frequency distribution. Once you have that frequency distribution, you can find a sample mean and a sample standard deviation using the formulas that we talked about in Chapter 3. Now in Chapter 4, we talked about finding probabilities. So let's say rather than doing 100 trials of this experiment where you're tossing a coin twice, we said, okay, in theory, what are the possible outcomes for the number of heads you can get if you toss a coin twice? So first what we would do is we'd find the sample space for 2 coin tosses. You could have a head and then a tails. You could have heads and then heads. You could have a tail and then a tail, or you could have a tail and then a heads. And then you would look at the probability of getting 0 heads or 1 head or 2 heads. You could use the classical approach to find each of those probabilities. So you have 0 heads, well, there's 1 outcome in the sample space, the one where you have tails and then tails. And then we divide by the total number of outcomes in the sample space, which is 4. So you'd have a 1 in 4 chance of having 0 heads. And then you'd have a 2 in 4 chance of getting 1 head because you could have a head and then a tail, or you could have a tail and then a head. And then you'd have a 1 in 4 chance for getting 2 heads. So in Chapter 5, what we're going to do is we're going to put kind of what we did in Chapter 2 and 3 together with what we did in Chapter 4 and to create a distribution using probabilities this time. And with this distribution, we're going to find expected results, not actual results. Chapters 2 and 3 was about doing a procedure or going through a procedure and then summarizing what we found. Chapter 5 is what we expect to find, is about what we expect to find. Here we're going to create a table called a probability distribution describing what we expect to happen. And then we can use that table to find a population mean and a population standard deviation. Now that's really nice when you have a population mean and a population standard deviation. We can do that because these probabilities are characteristics of populations and not associated with a particular sample. So this slide is just a visual of what we talked about on the last slide. Let's say you had 100 trials, and in 27 of those trials, you got 0 heads when you tossed the coin twice. And in 56 of those trials, you got 1 head, and in 17 of those trials, you got 2 heads. You could use this to calculate a sample mean, and you could use that to calculate a sample standard deviation. Or we could find the probability of getting 0 heads or 1 head or 2 heads using that classical approach that we talked about in chapter 4. Now, chapter 5 is about putting those two pieces together and coming up with this theoretical model of expected results. So we say if we toss a coin twice, we can either get 0 heads, 1 head, or 2 heads. What's the probability of each of those outcomes? Well, that's 1 in 4 or 2 in 4 or 1 in 4 as we discussed. So it's kind of it is definitely, a combination of what we did in chapters 2 and 3 and 4. The only difference is here we've got probabilities in this right column rather than frequencies. Frequencies are counts of something that actually happened. Probabilities are expectations for what we think ought to happen. And it's really not a matter of what we think should happen. It's what we know is the probability or the likelihood of that happening using that classical approach. So this is about expectations, what we expect to happen, and then this is past tense, what has already happened in the past, what actually happened. So in 5.1, we've got 6 learning outcomes. Our first learning outcome is to define a random variable and determine whether a given quantity is a discrete random variable, a continuous random variable, or neither. Then in our next learning outcome, we're going to learn more about probability distributions, and we're going to determine whether a given table represents a probability distribution by checking to see if it has certain characteristics. And then we'll visualize a probability distribution using a probability histogram. Then in learning outcome number 3, we'll learn to find the population mean, variance, and standard deviation given a probability distribution. In learning outcomes 4 and 5, we're going to determine whether a given value of a random variable is significantly high or significantly low. In 4, we're using the range rule of thumb. In 5, we're determining whether a result is a significantly high number of successes or a significantly low number of successes using probabilities. And then in 6, we're going to apply our understanding of expected value to make decisions. So we're going to look at some more gambling problems, and we're going to think about what the expected value is of playing a certain game and how that compares to the expected value of playing a different game. And then we can make decisions from there. So that's what 5.1 is about. I'll see you in the next video to discuss learning outcome number 1.